I'm Emilee Robbins, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro.
And I'm Andrew Turner. I'm also a second-year PhD student at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro.
And today we are talking to Dr. Richard Barton, and a little bit about Dr. Barton. He earned his MA and his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara.
And some of Dr. Barton's research interests include Central Medieval Europe from 950 to 1250, Western France, emotions, violence, bishops and cathedral chapters, and charters and diplomatic history.
And he has published several articles and has also published a monograph entitled Lordship in the County of Maine, circa 890 to 1160. And we wanted to start this interview by just asking the simple question of what drew you to study history?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Emilee and Andrew. It's a great pleasure to be here and hope I can offer something useful. I have to say that that might be the most difficult question to answer. It's hard to know. It's one of the things where you have always been reading about history, and I guess I liked stories and I liked drama. And as a young person, I read a lot because it was back in the dark ages before there was the internet and everything. So I read indiscriminately in fiction and nonfiction. And as many young boys of that era, I was really drawn to what seemed like the real stuff of history, that is military history. So I read a lot about battles and wars, and that seemed to be a fulcrum in human society where you could be looking for change over time, and you could be looking at how things became what they were and how good triumphed over evil potentially. And it was all very unnuanced and untheoretical, and I didn't really know that that would lead to anything else. But so that was sort of the early foundations, was that I read a lot, and I read a lot of military history, and that sort of drew me to kind of wanting to know the whys of these kinds of things.
Very interesting. I would say I had a very similar experience growing up too, and I noticed a lot of the young people I talk to are drawn in similar ways, especially young male historians have a similar growing up.
Agreed. And, I think we'll talk some about teaching a little bit later maybe, but it's something that we as faculty, I think, have to keep in mind, that although I'm not a military historian and I don't really teach about military history anymore, or never did, but I mean, I don't even study it for my research, that the people we're teaching at a place like UNCG are at a point where that's what they have come from. That was me in 1984 when I went to college, and to kind of reject that entirely is, I think, perhaps potentially a mistake. Obviously, we have other ways of thinking about the past as professional historians that are exciting, and we want to bring those in too. But sort of there's a balancing act between those things.
Yeah, definitely. So, to your recollection, is there maybe a travel experience or an event or a book in particular that you really remember sparking your interest or giving you some direction where you wanted to go?
Yeah, I do actually. It's pretty fixed in my memory. I read, as I said, I read a lot of fiction. I was a library page when it emerged that I was not going to be the next Bobby Orr because I was small and unaggressive. And I then got a job, and I worked in the town library from the age of like 15. And so I had access to all these books so I volunteered for shelving because it was a great way to find new things to read. Anyway, I came across this, I guess, relatively famous mystery novel by someone named Josephine Tay called A Daughter in Time, something like that. I can't remember the title right now. Anyway, and it tells the story of a detective in 1950s London who's got a broken leg, and he's in his hospital, and he's bored, and he doesn't know what to do. And so he decides he will solve the mystery of what happened to the Princes in the Tower, which is a classic English kind of whodunit thing and relating to the Middle Ages. And it was, if you know your Shakespeare or have heard of Richard III in Shakespeare is the evil villain who murders his nephews and immures them in the Tower of London. And everybody knows that it was Richard III. And in this novelization, the main character, whose name I've forgotten, eventually realized that that's just all Tudor slander of Richard III. And so that in fact, it was somebody else. Now I knew this was fiction, but I also thought it was really interesting. And that drew me to the Middle Ages. And I read a whole bunch in the end of high school and then into college about 15th century England. So there were other novels that I read then as a consequence. One called The Sun in Splendor, S-U-N-N-E, in ye olde medieval fashion. And I think that was by Sharon Penman, which was a novelization of the life of Richard III. And so that was really my deal. And when I took courses in college, all I wanted to do was study about Richard III in 15th century England. So,
yeah.
So it's pretty
Very cool.
vivid. That was it. But
Yeah,
I had other interests. I read a lot of American Civil War too. My aunt, one of my mom's sisters, had a whole bunch of that stuff. So I had all these things that were presented as classics, but now maybe have a more dubious air, like Lee's Lieutenants and Stonewall in the Valley, and all these kind of classics of that sort of white military history that doesn't really touch problems of slavery and race and things like that. So I had all that stuff too.
Very interesting. Yeah, and a lot of guys in the Civil War field have similar books like that drew them, and it's raising some of the questions of like they are problematic, but it led them to ask those questions as they matured as historians and be like, how can I be different from a previous generation? So it's good conversation starters.
It is, and for me, college was really transformational because I came in with a lot of factual knowledge and I had read a lot, so I could write decently because I was basically unconsciously mimicking the writing that I had done. I didn't think I was particularly well trained at it, but I would sign up for courses that I thought I was interested in. And I remember at the start thinking, how come we're not only talking about Richard III, or where's the battles in my Civil War class, whom I had with Charles Dew, who was a great professor and one of the pioneers of studying both economic history, but also of the history of slave populations in the South, right? He did this famous book on that. And so, I had a course on Civil War and Reconstruction with him that really changed the way I thought about the American Civil War, including some, internal embarrassments like, wow, did I really think those things? So that's, so for me, college was great. And the same with medieval history. I ended up writing a senior thesis in medieval history in 15th century England, and my advisor, who's a wonderful man, he gently steered me away from Richard III. That's like a third rail. You don't need to do that. Let's go for something more analytical than this kind of teenage love affair with a impossible to solve murder mystery. And it was good. And what I ended up with was really, I think, the kind of history that I'm still interested in. That is, I'm interested in concepts. I'm interested in the way that they're applied in terms of politics and culture. And that's what I did as a senior thesis.
Yeah, and I think that it's so interesting to hear that you kind of had this interest in medieval history almost from a young age, it sounds like. Yeah. And so I guess whenever you did enter into kind of thinking about, what you would want to study as a professional historian, how did you settle on the topic that you did? Because it sounds like you said, you had this kind of really a great interest in this one.
I had a lot of interest. The other big one for me was the British Empire of the 19th century. And again, from a sort of unformed pop history, but detailed pop history, semi-military history. And so when I was a senior in college, I still had strong interest in those three subjects: American Civil War, British colonial history, and the Middle Ages. And I'm a really bad example on how to prepare to go to a graduate program, because I had terrible advice about what to do. Nobody told me about language training, so we can talk about that another time maybe. And so I basically kind of rolled the dice, and I'm like, well, I like them all, but I kind of like medieval history better. But it was really up in the air until I just basically picked that one as one of three that I could have done. And I think it's because, well, this is the story I tell. And as we know, historians love to kind of use the present to justify the past, right? So the story that I tell about this was that for me, the Middle Ages served to be suitably distant, to be interesting distant from our present enough that I found them really interesting. Sometimes if it's too close, that just wasn't my kind of jam. But they were also recognizable in a way that one might have studied in a Western Civ class. That is to say, one could see origins if one were interested in such kind of things. So for me, the Middle Ages hit the sweet spot. The 19th century stuff I was really interested in, but it also just seemed a little bit too close. So I think that's probably what tipped it over. Was there was, I guess you might even say, a little romance to the Middle Ages that I didn't see in those other areas or didn't want to see. That's what it was. So, but I had terrible advice, and so I applied to graduate programs without any Latin, which is one of the big things I have to talk to students about today when they want to do medieval history, and that affected where I was accepted, even though I was a good candidate in lots of other ways. I also didn't have at all a shred of an idea about what I would do in graduate school. I just thought it was enough to decide you want to do that instead of my other options, which were to become an investment banker or a lawyer, which almost all of my classmates did. And I thought, well, I'm going to do the virtuous route and go to academia. But I didn't really, think very hard about how that, or I didn't know. No one in my family was an academic, so I didn't have any real training in that.
I think sometimes that's almost almost beneficial, going in with a blissful ignorance sometimes.
Yeah. No, it's good. I mean, I think I knew people who came in with very well-defined dissertation topics, and the problem there was that it was defined in their minds, but they might not be able to do that, or they might not be able to do it at the program they were in. So, in some sense, having a kind of an open field was good for me. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I thought I would go to Yale or Hopkins or someplace like that, and I didn't get accepted at those places for good reason, because as the guy at Hopkins wrote me, he said, well, you're a really strong candidate, but unfortunately, you don't have any languages. We could offer you, I guess, a propedeutic fellowship. And I thought, I have no idea what that is. Let's go to the dictionary. And it basically means remedial. It's like a fancy way of saying remedial. So he was going to offer me a couple $1,000s to come and hang out in Baltimore and study languages for a couple of years, which, was a responsible thing to do, because why would you take somebody who didn't have a well-defined topic and didn't have the language training? So, in some sense, I was kind of foolish. That is to say, I chose medieval without really understanding what that was. And it meant I had to work a lot harder when I got to grad school, because I took a intensive language course over the summer before I left. And then I took language every trimester I was there for the first 3 years or something like that. So it's hard. And it's too bad about American higher education or even elementary education, is that we don't hit those languages hard enough, or not universally. So it can be tough. There's a lot of smart people who come to me as seniors and say, hey, I want to go do medieval history. And it's possible, but it's less possible than it was in my day. Because there's so few, as you guys know, there's so few slots for PhD programs, and the programs are able to say, hey, that's just an easy mark of distinction. You've got Latin or you don't have Latin. If you don't have Latin, I've got these 10 people over here who do, and I might as well take them.
Yeah. How did you stumble upon, what you ended up studying? Was there a primary source base or like an archive that really led you a specific way, or?
Well, again, I'm a really bad example. So when I advise students who are interested in doing either undergraduates who want to go to a doctoral program or even an MA program, or MA students who want to go on, I always use myself as a counterexample, because again, I literally, so I told you I was all about the 15th century. So I ended up at Santa Barbara where nobody did the 15th century. Right? And again, as I'm saying, I didn't really understand this as a college student. But my advisor turned out to be the expert on King Henry I of England, who died in 1135, so 12th century, and really 11th and 12th century history was his particular forte. And in part, but this is back to my point, is that I was wide open. Well, I said, okay, fine, I'll do something in that too. That sounds interesting. What do I know about that? I can find a topic. Had I been really invested in the 15th century, it would have been a giant mistake, but I also might not have been accepted there. So anyway, he was a political historian and I would say a political and institutional historian of the old school. He had one interesting methodology that I did for my first two seminar papers. We had to write, every year we had to write a research paper that the model of which was a publishable article. And obviously it wasn't necessarily possible that you would do that every year, but you had to write something every year. And once you had a dissertation topic, the idea was that these papers would start to perhaps form chapters of your dissertation. So by the time you were ready to dissertate, you might have a couple of chapters already under the belt. Anyway, so my first two papers were very much in the shadow of my mentor, whose name, for the record, was C. Warren Hollister. And Hollister, his methodology was to look at a particular kind of document, which we would call a charter or a diploma. And these are, they're often described as legal instruments, although that's a little bit debatable, but they describe typically transfers of property or rights from one party to another. And in the period of the 11th and 12th century, they often come with lengthy witness lists as a way of, at least in one sense, attesting to the validity of the act and potentially as a way of checking against backsliding in the future, right? And so his interesting methodology was to kind of perform a quantitative analysis of these, that if you had all the charters for Henry I and you looked at all of the witnesses, which mounted into the thousands, you could track patterns of patronage, and you could track patterns of loyalty, and who were the people who were always around the king, and what did that say, where did they come from, where their lands were. So it was a pretty interesting method, and it was not without its flaws, but that's what I did at first. And that really was good for me because it put me into the weeds of history from the get-go. So like as a first-year MA student, I wrote this paper on the entourage of William Rufus, who was the king prior to Henry I, in which I took, they were like, he only had 250 charters. So I looked at every charter. My Latin was so bad that I didn't really have to read the text. I could simply look at the names and the witnesses, and I could count them all up and say, oh, look, the bishops are the most important set of advisors, and then followed by the royal family, and then followed by these magnates who are great nobles, and where are they coming from? That shows where the king's interests are and stuff like that. So it was a way of me doing research fast without some of those skills that I had. But I also recognized pretty quickly that Hollister would have loved to have all his students work in Henry I areas, and I didn't really want to do that. I was okay, but I didn't do that. And then I guess in my third year, we had 3 medievalists there, and there was a requirement that you take at least one research seminar with one of the medievalists who was not your mentor. And at first I thought, oh, this is really bad because I'm gonna have to do something in social history. And so I signed up for Professor Sharon Farmer's seminar, and boy, was that transformational, because that really made me into a much better historian and a much more interesting historian than I had been, I think. So, and she was really a French historian at that point. And I decided, well, there's this, at the time, the kings of England were also dukes of Normandy, and there's this big county just to the south of Normandy called Maine, from which we get the name of our state. And it seemed pretty unstudied, and maybe I could look at that. And that was adjacent to my advisor's interest, but not particularly, it wasn't something he knew very much about. Mm-hmm. And so the more I looked at it, the more interesting it became. And then as my French also started to improve, I started reading French scholarship, and found that there were some really interesting interpretive debates going on in the 90s, particularly the notion of la mutation féodale, or the feudal mutation. And the county of Maine turned out to be a perfect case study for that. And so that sort of cemented it, that Hollister was sufficiently interested because it was adjacent to the Normans. The Normans had an interest politically and militarily in this county, but I could basically forge my own path because he didn't know those charters. He didn't know that region, and it allowed me to kind of forge my own way. So that was that.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And I should, before we leave this, unless we come back, Farmer ended up being an extremely important influence in my intellectual trajectory, and really transformational. So I did with Hollister the kinds of things that I had already sort of natively wanted to do or nascently done in my senior thesis, but for the 15th century. And working with Sharon Farmer was just a revelation, and it forced me to think about the Annales School, and about mentalities, and about emotions, right? I wrote probably my best known paper in her seminar, and it was good enough that it became really my second publication, and probably my best known work. So, sort of learning about cultural history and gender and all these kinds of interesting ideas. So kind of the conceptual buzz came from her, and the geographic and temporal focus came from Hollister.
I guess that's a pretty good segue too, is do you have a publication or maybe like a conference presentation that you would say encapsulates your research or some of your methodology, or even one that you're just most proud of?
Yeah, that's well, I have a kind of a flip answer for that, and that is that I'm always most proud of the most recent.
Yeah.
the thing I've done most recently is the one I'm happiest with usually. Mm-hmm. And often looking back, especially over some years, you look at it and I'm like, well, yeah, that was good, but it could have been better. Mm-hmm. So the straight answer to your question is the one that I'm happiest about is a essay that is really the tip of the iceberg of my most recent research, and that was published in, I guess, last summer 2021 in Anglo-Norman Studies, which is an annual journal for this period in sort of the 11th and 12th century in England and France. And I wrote a paper called Enquête, Exaction, and Excommunication. And I forget what that comes after the colon. But I'm really proud of that. And it encapsulates some new ideas and some new research and some new sources. And it also broaches into the 13th century. So I'm sort of coming closer to the 15th century again. So that's that. But I will admit that probably my best known work is a paper that I published in 1998 called Zealous Anger and the Renegotiation of Aristocratic Relationships in 11th and 12th century France. As I said, that was actually a seminar paper that I wrote in 93. And Farmer liked it well enough that she promoted it, and I gave it at the American Historical Association in 94 with some professors, and that led to a volume edited by Barbara Rosenwein called Anger's Past, in which all of the essays were about anger. And so anyway, mine was in there with some pretty big names, and I was very pleased with that. And it's probably still my most cited paper, which, I'm proud of, but also it's like, wow, that was a long time ago. So let's get some of the more recent stuff in there too, but that's what it is.
Yeah, but that's really cool to have that opportunity, definitely. And it sounds like, during kind of your academic career that you had some teachers who were truly like supportive of your work. And I think that's a really great segue into kind of talking a little bit about teaching. What are some courses that you have taught that are your favorite to teach at UNCG?
Sure. Well, I'll preface that by saying that there are many different kinds of teachers, and I think I've told you this, Emilee, because you're currently my teaching assistant. My philosophy of teaching is that each teacher needs to kind of find their own path. And the metaphor that well, it's not a metaphor, but the advice I give is that you need to kind of absorb from everybody you see around you. And you say, I like that, but I don't like that. Or I could see myself doing this, but I really couldn't. I could try to do that, but it's going to be uncomfortable, and therefore I'm not going to do it. And so recognizing your own strengths and your own weaknesses and where that leads you. And, famously, as I've, talked to many people about, I'm a little ambivalent about group work. I do it to an extent in my classes, but it's not my favorite thing. So that's just an example of, but other people do it extremely successfully. So that's the kind of thing you have to figure out. So back to what courses, I also have another theory is that some people like to refine the same topic over and over again. I myself, I won't say I get bored with it, but for me, teaching is, even if the students don't recognize it, there's a joining of the students' interests and knowledge and mine. And so as long as I'm finding that I'm learning and processing new ideas from it, sometimes with the help of the students or sometimes just in the preparations that I do for teaching, then I'm all about that class. I love it. And if I start to feel like, well, I'm just going to keep repeating the same thing over and over again to a new set of faces, then I get a little itchy. And that's when I look to develop a new course. So, I say this really not as a boast, and it's really kind of dumb in some ways, but I have a ton of classes. I mean, I've taught a lot of classes. I've developed a lot of new classes because every once in a while I decide, well, this would be fun to try, in part because I want to learn about it. So, I think for undergraduates, the ones that are currently the most popular would probably be my course on the Crusades and my course on the Vikings. And both those go back to our first question, Andrew. And, they do attract a lot of boys or men. And there is a sort of healthy interest in these things, seem like they're kind of, about violence and about warfare. And they aren't necessarily about that when they take the class, but the subject matter seems attuned to that. And so perhaps that's why they're interesting. I will also note that I do research in neither of those fields, so I feel like a complete imposter. So part of the interest for me was that I had to read a lot, and that was very useful, just kind of intellectually, but even some professionally, that I was able to learn some things. So those two are pretty popular. I leave aside the survey, which I have taught since 1998, and in about 10 different iterations. I keep changing it to kind of match my own interests and what the students are capable of doing and things like that. So there's that. And at the upper level, I have taught a topics class that has also varied in topic. When I first came here, it was really a outgrowth of my graduate years, so it was mostly about Anglo-Norman nobles. And then I decided that my research was on the history of emotions. So I developed one on the history of emotions in the Middle Ages. And then more recently, I've developed one on violence, because that's where a lot of my research is right now, on the conceptualization of violence and its deployment as a subjective category in medieval texts. So that also has been really productive. And at the graduate level, it's funny. I don't know to what degree you're familiar with the history of the graduate programs here, but we had a really vibrant European MA group until about 2010. And for various reasons that I can't really identify, or I have ideas about that sort of dried up. So our MA students are mostly Americanists now. But before that, I often taught an occasional topics class at the 700 level on something in medieval history, which was fun. And now, as you both know, I end up teaching graduate students primarily historiography. So we teach the historiography class, History 510, which is about the different ways in which historians have approached the study of the past over time, different schools of thought, different methods. And then I also teach the European colloquium, which is so hopelessly vast in its definition that it really ends up being a exercise in trying to choose representations over time that I think match what the students are interested in, what I think are important topics, and important methodologies too. So
that definitely turned out to be one of my favorite courses, actually, just for its variety and diversity. And the section that you taught on slavery ended up helping me immensely. And I used some of that Moses Finley framework stuff in a lot of my own work. So.
Thanks for that. I'd forgotten about that. I mean, I'm not forgotten about it because we're in it right now. But that was really powerful for me too. I had resisted joining 716 because I didn't consider myself to be a world historian, and what did I know about anything outside of Europe before 1500? And I finally decided to join. It was a great thing, again, for my intellectual growth and for thinking conceptually about a lot of topics. And Yeah, I'm glad you like that, because I've really enjoyed it too. And I know for some people, the people who really want there to be definite answers for everything, my unit can be a little tough because I don't have any, and it's hard to really propose them. But if one of the goals of history is to kind of explode received assumptions, then that I hope helps in that direction too.
Yeah, that section especially really opened my mind to how much I enjoyed theoretical and intellectual history, and it was a field that I always was sort of intimidated by and thought,
Right.
this isn't really my niche. But when I actually got into it, I was like, oh, this is really getting me going here. So
yeah. Well, cool. Thanks.
So is there one tip that maybe you would give to someone who's starting to teach their own courses? You sort of have taught about or talked a little bit about absorbing and rejecting things that you think fit your style well, which I think is great advice. But is there one tip that's really guided you?
Well, that's a hard one. I think because it varies a lot on your temperament and your style as a teacher. I know for me, I seem to have a pretty good relationship with my students, both at the graduate and the undergraduate level. And I know that may sound vain or something like that, but I think, and so I've tried to analyze that over the past. Why is it that they seem comfortable around me? And I think part of it is that I think it's important to treat them as human beings. That is them, that is students as human beings, and kind of to separate the person from the student. That is to say, I may have to grade you, I may have to give you a C on this paper, but I really still am interested in you as a person, and I find what you have to say interesting. And so I'm not, obviously some students are not going to be happy to receive a C, but I think that helps. And so I think it's a really ineffable quality, but somehow being, I hate to say easygoing a little bit. And I know that can slide into being a pushover, and I hope I don't have that reputation, but who knows? And so I think for me, it was just sort of accepting that I know a lot of new teachers are worried about their authority. And like when I was a TA at the age of 22, I was scared to death because what did I know about Western Civ? I'd never had a course in Western Civ. I'd never had anything on these subjects. But I remember another TA telling me, you have the red pen, and that's all the authority that is needed. And it was kind of true, right? And so, even though there were students who were older than I was, it didn't matter because I had I had the office. And then if I could treat them as human beings, then we could come to a more congenial relationship in the classroom. So, I guess my response is to not treat class like an antagonism or as we all know that there are different strata and statuses, and we all know that there's a power differential. But I think there's a way of approaching teaching that de-emphasizes that, or at least doesn't actively encourage it, and that can be an effective tool. That's been an effective tool for me. I'll just say that.
Yeah, and I think that, I guess, like building on that, just to affirm as your teaching assistant and as a former student of yours, I do think that I've learned a lot from your specific style of teaching. This, very open, very receptive, kind of air about you, I guess. I do think that it's something that specifically I've been, this semester especially, been trying to kind of emulate that, and being very gracious and being very, creating a safe space for students. And I think that has made a world of difference, particularly in kind of this moment.
Definitely.
Coming out of the pandemic and everything. I think students, if they come into the classroom and they feel safe in that environment, they're far more open to sharing their ideas, to speaking up, to sharing their struggles. And I think that that's been really helpful for me in order to get to know the students, but also kind of understand where they're coming from and adapt to that as well, which has been really nice.
Agreed. And I knew from the first day I set foot in a classroom as a TA at age 22 that I never wanted to be a high school teacher, because I didn't want to have to be the disciplinarian. And over the years, I've had to adopt more discipline than I thought I was going to have to. But you're exactly right. That's sort of the approach that I take, is that, I think we're all adults. I may be older than you, but we're all adults, and you have your life, and I know sometimes that's going to intervene. And as long as you understand what I'm asking, and you understand that there may be consequences if you have problems with that, and you don't ask me about it first, then we're all good. And I try not to judge that. So I don't know. That's my approach.
I think as we're kind of having our time come to a close,
yeah.
Would you have any advice for someone who, I guess, is thinking about getting a PhD or entering academia? And especially anything that you wish that you would have known before, kind of starting this path.
Well, I mean, I think we can't ignore, the bugbear in the room, which is that it's a really tough time for humanities PhDs. So what I try to tell students these days is that it's absolutely the right decision to go for a PhD, as long as you go in with your eyes wide open. And again, I use myself as a bad example of that, because I didn't have any idea. And so I think, the department, sometimes we do it better sometimes than other times, but I think it's important for departments to kind of demystify the process of graduate education. A lot of undergraduates simply think it's going to be just like being an undergraduate, when, as you guys know, it's obviously not. And both in terms of what you do and what the expectations are, and what sort of prerequisites there might be. So again, we've talked earlier, in my field, there are significant prerequisites. So if somebody, has always wanted to be a professor of medieval history, it's the wrong time to come to me as a senior and ask about that. The right time, if you really know that, is as a freshman, so you can start taking Latin if you haven't had it before. Right. So part of it is, I think, feeling comfortable asking professors about the process, and hopefully the professors are willing to talk to students about that. I mean, I always am. And these days I have to be honest and say it's a tough job. I mean, it's a tough decision to make, because the jobs are so few on the ground, and it is going to be very stressful and all those kinds of things. So I guess, that's not a sort of a mealy-mouthed response, but I think you should go for it, as long as you know how hard it's going to be, and you have to be aware of that, and to maximize your chances as best you can.
Yeah,
but
I think
I feel badly for you guys, because I mean,
that's true. That's great advice. And I think demystifying, sort of that academic process, and just talking to professors is such a huge thing. I was fortunate enough during my undergrad and master's program to have professors that were straightforward with me about, what's going to be tough, especially in the modern world of academia, or if you, pursue the degree and decide to get out of academia, how you're going to have to, shift yourself. So, going into it and them saying, if that's the only thing you can picture yourself doing, then it's the right decision to make. So
and also, I mean, I guess a corollary to that, I know we have to finish up pretty soon, but is one of the things I often encounter is students who think, well, I live in North Carolina, I expect to go to Chapel Hill for my PhD in history, and there are only 3 PhD programs in the state, and Chapel Hill is pretty desirable. And the chances are, just by kind of the odds, that you're not going to get into Chapel Hill. So one of the toughest things is to accept that if you really are committed to doing doctoral work in history, you should go where the program is right for you. And that includes, that means you should be willing to go to Santa Barbara. Mm-hmm. Like, had I ever heard of Santa Barbara? Heck no. But the one piece of advice I remember getting back then was, we see a lot of job applicants coming from this place in California, University of California, Santa Barbara. I don't really know it, but you could look there, I was told. So I sent in an application there, right? Did I want to live in California? Well, as it turned out, it was pretty damn cool to live there. But it wasn't something I would have chosen, right? I'm a Northeasterner. I thought I would be going to school in Massachusetts or New York, or even down to Maryland, but not California. And same thing on the other side, right? My mother still, this day, she's like, why don't you get a job in Massachusetts? just not the way it works.
Yeah.
Right? I am very fortunate to have a job in a place that I really enjoy in North Carolina. Yet that was not where I envisioned being, right? I, again, had been in Massachusetts and then in California. So one of the things I think is to understand the process, and that is that you need to find a program where you can be accepted and where the fit between you and your professors is going to be right too. And that can mean traveling to new parts of the country, which can be a good experience.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's really, really great advice. Yeah, I definitely agree wholeheartedly with all of that, especially with what I have learned from the past, I guess, 4 years in grad school.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for joining us and for telling us a little bit about your life and about teaching and research. It's been really edifying. So,
well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was fun.